Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
July has been an unusually busy month for diplomacy, with a steady stream of both incoming and outgoing visits. This month started with Japan's Prime Minister Takaichi's visit to Delhi, her first trip to India since being elected in February. Shortly after, Prime Minister Modi embarked on a three-nation tour to Indonesia, Australia, and now New Zealand. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, NATO leaders gathered for their annual summit. And Trump casually during the summit called Iran the Islamic Republic of Japan. I mean, at this point, his slip ups are not even as surprising anymore. Anyway, to discuss all this and more, I'm here today with my colleague Amit Kumar from the Geostrategy team. Amit, glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Vanshika.
And I'm Vanshika from the Geostrategy team as well. So let's start with the first visit, the visit to Jakarta. So this is the first bilateral visit by our Prime Minister to Indonesia after the relationship was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership in May 2018. There were some major deals signed, including those on the BrahMos missiles and the Astra missiles. So Amit, what are your thoughts on this visit?
Thank you so much, Vanshika. So, for me, Indonesia is one of those countries where I want India to engage more with a country with I want India to engage a lot more. And there are a few factors as to why I feel that way, right? So, one, Indonesia is a neighbor with which we share a maritime boundary, and it does make Indonesia our maritime neighbor. But often, when we talk about neighborhood and our neighborhood and neighborhood strategy, neighborhood policy, India's neighborhood engagement, Indonesia is often not part of the discussion. So I'm very glad that this visit has happened, and we have had a lot of key takeaways from this visit, about 18 or 20 agreements or so, right?
Yeah.
Then second, you have a shared culture and history. And again, here, this is very important. Yes, we often talk about shared culture and history when we talk about India's engagement with our neighbors, right? But while other neighbors, India's neighbors, harbor that kind of insecurity with India when it comes to the shared cultural and historical past, right? And you would say there's a historical connect and cultural connect with all of our neighbors, but yet there's a insecurity or cultural insecurity, and in part, and to a great extent, that also explains Pakistan's behavior towards India. But the fact of the matter is that there's this cultural insecurity because there's huge asymmetry that India presents vis-a-vis its neighbors. But this is not true with regards to Indonesia. Indonesia is a very proud country when it comes to its cultural roots and heritage, which is, of course,
Right.
India has influenced that. And even though a large proportion of the population is Muslim, right? But yet they're very proud of their cultural roots and heritage. And therefore, that insecurity doesn't exist, right? Of course, non-contiguous land boundary, its size, both in demographics and economic terms, Indonesia is already a $1.5 trillion economy, if I'm not mistaken. These also play a part. And the fact that its strategic focus remains towards further east, while India's strategic focus is largely around the Indo-Pacific and the North, etc. Right? So that also plays a part. But then again, this goes on to say that these two neighbors, maritime neighbors, do not have mutual distrust or asymmetry or kind of insecurity, something that India's other neighbors have vis-a-vis India, right? And then again, in post-independence period, India and Indonesia were instrumental in mounting the non-alignment challenge during the Cold War years. So there's a history there as well in the post-colonial era, right? Then Indonesia is also a big country and by no measure a smaller power, and has all ingredients to be a major middle power in the global mix. And the fact that it's the biggest ASEAN country and the largest economy within the ASEAN, and the fact that it's all situated at a very strategic location. If you look at the global map, the way Indonesian geography runs or territory runs, you would see that, and this is very relevant with respect to our considerations about China, right? And if you see that map, you would see that there is no way the Chinese ship or a Chinese container looking to trade with the western parts of the world can traverse without passing through the waters and seas adjoining Indonesia. So Indonesia and Malacca Strait is one thing that Indonesia oversees, right? Along with Malaysia. So Indonesia is quite strategically located in that sense. And I'm
Yeah.
very glad that even if you look at the joint statement that has come out, right?
Yeah.
The joint cooperation and development, co-development of Sabang port, which is just, I think, about 90 miles away from India's the Great Nicobar Island, where India itself has a project that is coming up, which India wants to develop it into a place of economic and strategic significance. So if there is some possibility wherein this India's Great Nicobar Island project can be, synced with the port development in Sabang, I think in the future, in the times to come, if need arises, it would be good and very valuable asset, strategic asset to counter China in the future if need arises, right? So
Yeah.
these are some of the few reasons. And lastly, I think the fact that Indonesia has maritime disputes with China, and it also faces Beijing's unilateral decisions in South China Sea, the fact that it's a problem that
Yeah.
further forces a strategic convergence on national security issues, right? And this was reflective in the kind of agreements that we did on defense, especially with respect to BrahMos missile, where in Indonesia expressed an interest in acquiring those, and now we have a cooperation agreement, and we'll have to see how much time it takes for India to deliver on those commitments and what kind of commitments are actually there. But the fact that Indonesia now has become the third ASEAN country after Philippines and Vietnam
Yes.
to express interest in buy the BrahMos missile is very significant for me. And with this, I'll end. One bet for me here is that within ASEAN, for me at least, there are three most important countries from India's perspective when it comes to, if you look at the region from geopolitical and security perspective, including maritime perspective, and those are Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And now all these three countries have a deal or an agreement on acquiring BrahMos from India, knowing fully well that it would irk China, and yet proceeding ahead with this. And this goes on to show the kind of growing trust these countries now enjoy with India. And that to me is a very powerful and substantive takeaway, right? Countries like Myanmar, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, etc. You'll always face very stiff competition with China, right? But these are the three countries I think are very important, are also big countries within ASEAN and have more to lose and will not submit easily to the Chinese. And therefore, I'm quite happy with how this visit has unfolded and the kind of agreements that we have had. We need to engage more with Indonesia.
Yeah, I completely agree, Amit. And I'll add a few things of why I think the visit was very important. So, as I mentioned, this is the first bilateral visit since 2018. But as you said, Indonesia is an important partner, and that's evident given the fact that this was Modi's officially fourth visit to Indonesia. So he was there in 2022 for the G20 summit. He was there in 2023 for the ASEAN summit. And now this is the first standalone meeting. And secondly, I think why it's even more important is because President Subianto, who came to power in towards the end of 2024, visited India shortly a few months later in January 2025. So I think this reciprocal visit is extremely important to sustain that momentum. And also a little bit on the domestic politics here. So Indonesia's last president was Joko Widodo, who served two consecutive terms. He served as for a decade from 2014 to 2024. And the BrahMos deal, most of the deals were actually initiated under his administration. So the fact that this agreement has now been concluded under President Subianto, I think is a great news. And it suggests that the cooperation between India and Indonesia on defense, on other issues, is not tied to a single administration, right? There is a much broader institutional foundation that the two countries work on. And as you mentioned, so maritime cooperation is something that both countries see eye to eye on. And here I think we need to understand it from two levels. One is, as you said, like the non-traditional civilian-facing risks, which is, search and rescue, disaster response, crime prevention, and an agreement on all of this was actually signed last year. But there's obviously the larger strategic picture at play, right? Since today maritime instability is not just about piracy or smuggling. There's gray zone activity, there's coercive naval presence, and then, as you mentioned, the presence of Malacca Strait, which is one of the most important passageways for global trade. It lies right between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. So, I think, given the anxieties after the Hormuz closure, cooperation with Indonesia definitely gives India a very strong partner in, in Indian Ocean. And also, I think another thing that the joint statement I thought was, very significant was the discussion around economic security. And why I think this is the case, because Indonesia actually is one of the world's largest producers of nickel. It produces nearly 60% of the world's nickel supply. And India, on the other hand, possesses virtually no domestic reserves. So we rely a lot on Indonesia for nearly all of our ferronickel imports, which are essential to the steel industry, and obviously for clean energy, EV, batteries, etc. But what I found interesting is that Indonesia does not allow the export of raw materials. So basically, it requires nickel to be processed domestically before it can be exported. Now, a lot of the processing facilities are owned by China, but India now is also looking up to set up processing and manufacturing plants within Indonesia. So I think in progress on that sort of conversation is really something that also happened during this visit. And as you said, what I really liked is the soft power and the cultural aspect that you brought in, right? Because we know both countries have this deep civilizational history. And something that stood out for me was this initiative that India has, started for the restoration of an old temple site. So I think, these initiatives, they may not be very flashy, they may not, be as, say, consequential as a BrahMos deal, but they do add a lot of depth to the engagement. So I think these were sort of my takeaways from the visit. Now, moving forward, after Indonesia, the next stop for Prime Minister Modi was Australia. And here also we saw a lot of substantive outcomes. There was progress on uranium exports. There was a new declaration on defense and security. So, Amit, what's your assessment of the significance of Australia today? We meet so many, Australian counterparts during our work. So, how do you see Australia's importance, both as a bilateral partner and also as a member of the Quad, obviously?
Yeah. Australia is one country that I'm not too worried about when it comes to bilateral partnership or bilateral relations. Australia has emerged as a key partner for India in the last 5 years, I would say, in the post-pandemic period.
Yeah.
The relationship has really deepened extensively and has made tremendous progress post 2020, post 2020, 2021, I would say. If you remember, Australia was a very hesitant partner, especially when it came to security, because that's where the initial convergence was. So there are two reasons why countries, especially from the West, normative West, want to partner with India. One is the China challenge, and the second is economic opportunities that India presents, that or the Indian market presents, right? But while the economic lucrativeness of India was still of significance, security partnership with India was still something which the Australians were very hesitant about. I'm reminded of that instance related to the Malabar exercise, if you remember,
Yeah.
uh, in which India and US initially used to conduct together. But there was a time when there were talks about Australia coming along as a permanent participant of the exercise. And Australia even joined as an observer before 2020 or 2018. I'm not sure of the year. But uh, when there were talks about having Australia as a permanent participant in Malabar exercises, Australia was hesitant and it withdrew. It declined the offer, right? And
Yeah.
that, in a sense, had kind of soured. I mean, not in a big way, but had kind of soured the relations between India and Australia. And then the second sticking point was, of course, with respect to trade, especially the dairy sector. And India and Australia have not seen eye to eye on when it comes to dairy, because Australia is a huge dairy exporter and a huge dairy industry, and it wants to enter Indian market. But given that India wants to protect there's a domestic dairy lobby that India wants to protect and has to concede to, that has never gone ahead. And that it was also a challenge, or I would say a factor that undermined India's commitment to RCEP, and India had to finally withdraw. So I think dairy was one big factor why India did not get into RCEP. And I would actually fault India here, But there were issues, right? These are the issues which, unsettling issues in India-Australia relations. But after 2020, 2021, after the pandemic hit and after how China reacted, that was when the Australian feelings or sentiments of China, started to overturn and started to change. And therefore, you also see that that's 2021 is also around the time that both Quad as a platform, as a grouping, and India-Australia relations picked up steam, right? 2021 was a time. And since then, India and Australia have spent a lot of energy and time in building this relationship. And the stress test of this particular relationship was actually the Ninja episode of the Ninja case of 2023, 2024, right? And Australia, being part of that Five Eye Club and the normative West, could have easily gone out and condemned India's actions, but rather it prioritized the strategic value in the relationship, despite not being happy with the how things had unfolded or how India had handled the issues, right? So Australia has done a lot to invest in this relationship, and I think the big takeaway from this agreement was the operationalization of the administrative agreement under 2014 Civil Nuclear Agreement.
Yes.
And I think it's another such step to build trust and expand cooperation. Now, again, this is very significant because Australia was one of the countries which was very pissed off at India after the 1999 nuclear test, and it was one of the first countries to sanction us. So it's a value-based issue for them, as it is for every other normative West country. But from there, we have come a long way to here where we have finally, operationalized this. And India actually needs this. Australia being a huge, harbors a lot of, it has a lot of nuclear and uranium deposits, right?
Yes.
And because India has certain commitments under UNFCCC, where towards making a transition towards clean energy and green energy, India actually needs those kind of nuclear fuels. And Australia being having one of the largest deposits of uranium is key towards that pathway, right? So I think genuinely India also recognizes the value that Australians themselves attach. And as I said, Quad has really been instrumental in bringing the two countries together. And therefore, I would say the bilateral agreements alone, when we speak of India and Australia, bilateral agreements alone aren't enough and aren't a true marker or indicator of what the two countries have achieved so far, or what the two countries are doing. The extent and the breadth of the cooperation, you'll not get a sense if you just look at the two countries' bilateral relations. But also you have to look at Quad and what the countries are doing within Quad. And Australia within Quad is quite, I would say, enthusiastic partner and has done a lot. And they have cooperated, I think, also in Fiji, right?
Yes.
For the 5G tower and the communication network, optical fiber cable that they installed in Fiji.
Yes.
Right. So these are the things that India and Australia have been doing, and I think this is a partnership. I think if I have to pick one country in the past 5 years where the relationship has grown by leaps and bounds, it would be India-Australia relations. And the only criticism, or I think a front where India and Australia can do something that would further drive or give a fillip or push to this relationship would be a quick transition from ETCA to SECA, the economic trade cooperation agreement, to comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, right? So that is something. And finally to FTA. And again, as I said, dairy is one big sticking issue in that question. And I think the sooner the two countries, put this thing behind and conclude a deal on trade, the better it will be for the relationship. And of course, we have the Chinese to thank for this relationship, India-Australia relationship, but also lately US under Trump to thank for. And I'm quite satisfied with how India-Australia relations have, evolved in the last 5-6 years.
Yes, I share your optimism, Amit, fully on the broader trajectory of the relationship. And just on the civil nuclear arrangement, right? It's interesting that you mentioned how Australia was not really happy after India's test. That actually reminded me of Japan. So India and Japan also have a civil nuclear agreement that they signed about in 2016. But surprisingly, there has been no commercial transfer yet. It was a big deal when it was signed because the Japanese parliament had to approve it. And again, it seemed like, okay, finally India is seen as a responsible nuclear actor. But again, nothing much was achieved from that. So I am really happy to see that we finally have some progress on uranium exports. And as you said, we ourselves have a domestic target of, I think, 100 gigawatts of nuclear energy capacity by 2047. So I think this agreement will definitely contribute to having a more sort of diversified and reliable fuel supply. And similarly, as you said, for Australia, right, India provides this big market. And interestingly, Australia does not produce any nuclear energy itself for its own commercial power grid. While, as you said, it holds one of the largest, uranium reserves in the world. Domestically, they have a lot of laws and legislation that prohibit, even the construction and operation of any nuclear power plant. And they have no economic incentive to pursue nuclear energy. But it's great to see that this agreement has now been concluded, despite obviously India not being a party to NPT and all of the concerns that Australia had around non-proliferation. And apart from this, I would say that there are two more things that I thought were significant. One was the establishment of the annual defense ministers dialogue. As you said, we do a lot of military exercises together. There've already been ministerial consultations, but I think placing this dialogue on an annual basis is a great start to making this relationship a lot more regular politically. And the second, I would say, was the memorandum between the Indian Coast Guard and the Australia's Maritime Border Command. Right? I mean, Coast Guard, cooperation is something that is always discussed under the Quad, but the fact that both the countries have come together and signed this bilaterally, I think is again a good movement. Having said that, on the nuclear deal, fingers crossed. The announcement, while very welcoming, right now there is no disclosure on what the quantity would be, who the suppliers would be, or if there's any schedule on the table. But it has removed a very important, let's say, administrative obstacle. Hopefully we can see a lot more deliverables from this. So moving on, Amit, we have actually seen PM Modi visit Australia quite a few times now, but somehow he never went to New Zealand. This time that changed, making it the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to New Zealand in 40 years. And I think it comes at a great time because just in April, both countries have signed an FTA, which is still pending finalization, of course. As you said, how dairy is a sticking point with Australia. It's the same with New Zealand as well. But broadly, India has been very unusually active on, signing FTAs. This year, we've done it with the UK, with the EU. Obviously, there's one, in talks with the US. So, Amit, what's your assessment of this sort of new wave of economic diplomacy?
See, on India's Prime Minister's first visit in 40 years to New Zealand, I think this is something which needs to be taken seriously. And the point that I was making in the beginning as well, I think we need to engage a lot more with countries like New Zealand, Indonesia. I mean, so-called smaller powers, but still influential, right? And somehow we are always fixated with engagement with bigger powers.
Yeah.
I mean, be it the US, Russia, EU, even China. We talk to China more often. And rightly so. We must talk to China, US, and these major centers of power, the great centers of power. But for a country like India, which is a middle power trying to create or shape in outcomes in the global arena, I think you need to talk to these smaller countries much more often than we actually do. And I mean, if we take out the history and the number of visits that our Prime Minister has done, and how many of those visits have been to these smaller countries, including in Latin America or Africa, or New Zealand is not so one of the lesser known countries, right? And yet it took 40 years for an Indian Prime Minister to visit New Zealand. Now think about other smaller countries in maybe say Latin America or Africa. I mean, maybe we have not visited a lot of these countries since our independence, and that's something that we need to change if we want to cultivate the kind of influence that we have. And if it, just to bring in an example, or just to make a comparison with the Chinese, every second week you have 2 to 3 leaders coming to China, paying visit to China, something that we do not see in India, right? So game of diplomacy that India must pick on. And it really goes on to say that we need to pull up our socks when it comes to dealing with these smaller, lesser known economies and countries. Now, on FTA, I think it's a really good step, even though it took us 40 years to visit New Zealand. The fact that we have concluded an FTA with pending finalization, as you said, I think it's a very good step. And again, New Zealand and the dairy sector, again, in New Zealand and Australia, were the two big, were the sticking point for India in RCEP. And the fact, and it tells me something that if India manage to, conclude an FTA, sign an FTA with New Zealand, I think it should not be that difficult for India to also do a similar deal with the Australians, right? So it's a good thing that India has concluded this FTA, and India went on to this. To your final question that you asked about the new wave of economic diplomacy, I think India uh, has gone on a FTA signing spree after India pulled out of RCEP. And I mean, it would have been good had India been part of RCEP, but India is trying to make up for the opportunity that it lost. I mean, I don't think if the government feels that it lost the opportunity, but yeah, for some reason, the government feels that concluding bilateral treaties where you can, have rather than having one overarching consensus that is made to every other trading partner, you could have case by case basis concession that you can make to individual countries, and that would be more productive. But again, that takes a lot of time. In RCEP, you could have had an FTA with about 20 countries at once simultaneously. Here, it will take you years. Already has taken about 8 years, and we are still not there, right? So I think, but still, if not part of the RCEP, it's good to see that India is concluding successive FTAs and with major countries. And I hope this materializes sooner than later. Because, see, in my opinion, the biggest problem of Indian foreign policy, I mean, okay, I shouldn't say biggest problem, but one of the major problems of India's foreign policy has been its disconnect with its economic policy. Economic policy in India is still driven to a great extent by its domestic imperatives, the domestic considerations, electoral cycles, lobbying, interest groups, pressure groups, etc. And somehow India's foreign policy or or relations with other countries and how it the kind of relationships it has with other countries has not yet emerged as a true driver of how India conducts its economic policy. And you need to bring these two in sync, because no matter how many deals you conclude with these agreements, at the end of the day, these have to hit the shores of Indian territory. And the moment they do, most of these things falter, because India has not made accommodations in line with the kind of foreign relations India wants with these countries. So you go and promise something in MOUs, etc. But if you have not made structural changes to in your domestic economic environment or ecosystem to be in sync with your foreign policy, all those your agreements with partner countries start falling, right? So that's a real challenge. I think India is doing good in the sense that it has taken this economic diplomacy seriously, and I really hope that we see more of this in the coming years.
Right. Completely on board with you, Amit. Whether that's, on visiting middle powers like New Zealand, and something that we should focus on more. And also on the bit where we do see some sort of misalignment between maybe our economic policies and our foreign policy, and the ambition especially that we have, in both those arenas. So talking about, all things strategic, I want to quickly get your view also on the NATO summit, right, that took place. Yes, it's far. Yes, we were not there at the NATO summit. Most of the countries that we've discussed today in the podcast, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, their defense ministers were there. South Korea's president was there. I mean, I'm talking about non-NATO members. We also saw a few Gulf countries being there. India, obviously, historically has resisted military alliances and engagement with them, so it's only natural. But the discussions, obviously ranged to both the wars, Ukraine war, the current West Asia war, but also something that featured prominently was European rearmament, right? So there was an announcement of more than 50 billion euros in new procurement, the substantial investment in drones, in defense industrial capacity. And this will, of course, create a lot of openings for Indian defense suppliers, which is great news. But also importantly, the summit made clear that NATO will continue to support Ukraine. And in fact, separately, they've pledged some 70 billion euros just for military equipment, assistance, and training to help with the Ukraine war. So just on this, it means in anyone's understanding that this confrontation between the Russia and, as you said, the normative West is unlikely to ease anytime soon. So how do you assess this development affecting India's partnership with Europe, or even broadly its partnership with Russia?
See, I think by now we all know in the past 3-4 years the kind of problem this war has brought for Indian diplomacy,
Yeah.
its relationship with Europe, in its relationship with Russia, in its relationship with the US. I mean, India has tried to please all three parties here, and certainly the Ukrainians have not been very happy. So yes, Russia is your traditional strategic partner. You have a lot of defense ties. You depend on a lot of Russian military hardware to support your military inventory that you require, when you are engaged in a confrontation against the Chinese, which again started in 2020 and like continued for around 2024. Still, there's no proper de-induction of the troops in
Yeah.
Ladakh, even though you have seen disengagement and de-escalation. I mean, de-escalation and de-induction we are still waiting for de-escalation and de-induction. That is something that we have not seen. So you need to be you need to have good friendships with Russians. And the Russians, again, you don't want Russians to be too much in, in the China and get into the Chinese sphere of influence. So it also makes sense, because why would you want a Asian security architecture where you have three nuclear armed power countries betting against you? China and Pakistan are already your neighbors and are nuclear powers. Do you want an Asian security architecture where even Russia becomes uh, becomes an enemy of your country, right? You don't
Yeah.
want that situation. So you need to balance your relations with Russia, even though you do not agree you do not agree with what Russia is doing in Europe or vis-a-vis Ukraine. And but then again, and this is something which has been very difficult for India to convince the Americans and the Europeans, even though I mean they have been very I mean they themselves have been very unfaithful, I would say, and in the sense that they have engaged with Russians themselves. When it suits them, they would engage with Russians, and when it doesn't, they would punish others, right? Even though the Europeans were the biggest buyers of the oil that India was buying from Russia, reprocessing, and then
Yeah.
selling it in the market. Europeans were the biggest beneficiaries of that arrangement, right? And yet, the US and Europeans, lobbied for restrictions on India. So I would say this is a difficult situation to be in, and honestly, the sooner this war ends, this would alleviate India's concerns, and there'll be lesser problems for us and Indian diplomacy. So I think so long this war continues, I mean, yes, recently we have again, because the crisis in West Asia and what US has been, done in Iran, we have again they have eased restrictions on India. India they have asked Indians to buy more oil from Russia if it eases the prices in the global market. But again, these are all temporary issues, right? And in a way, the crisis in West has allowed this difficult balancing game for the Indian diplomats to has taken attention away from this thing, and therefore it has become easier for them to balance the relations. So either that, but in all honesty, the war both in West Asia and Ukraine needs to end for the good.
Yeah. Yeah, agree there. I think what I found interesting was with the atmosphere before the summit, right? There was a lot of uncertainty around US commitment to European security in general. Trump has openly criticized European allies. He's complained that, they didn't help him keep the Strait of Hormuz open. But ultimately at the summit, he sort of reiterated support for NATO, for Article 5. In fact, I think he told some reporters there was a lot of love in the room, a lot of unity. So in the short term, maybe he prevented some sort of immediate rupture. with the Europeans, and the concerns about long-term American reliability. And I think he's even promised that he'll allow Ukraine to manufacture US Patriot air defense systems. We don't know what decision he'll take on that, but very interestingly, shortly after the NATO summit ended, we saw him go and authorize retaliatory strikes on Iran. So, I mean, this sort of just tells you how uncertain the world is, right? And I
Right.
think NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was, then asked about this, and he's like, "Look, Iran is outside NATO territory. If helpful, NATO is willing to play a role, but let's see what's happening." Now, I don't know if this will please Trump or not. But yeah, things are quite uncertain, on both the conflicts, I would say. And yeah, another country that's very difficult to please, of course, is China. And what I found interesting was before Takaichi's visit, China again imposed its, export controls that it had announced a few months ago. And just after the visit, it issued a statement, the foreign ministry, that such cooperation should not harm any third-party interests, etc. So, as we conclude this podcast, I think to know more about these developments, I would urge all our listeners to two recent publications. One is a fantastic China Coercion Tracker by Amit. It basically offers a risk exposure assessment and a very comprehensive mind map of China's economic statecraft. Also, check out my latest issue brief on the drivers' responses and implications of the recent escalation between China and Japan. With that, we come to an end of this podcast. Amit, thank you so much for that conversation. It was extremely insightful.
Thank you so much, Vanshika, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.